I'm Sarah Wilson, and you're listening to the Roots and All Budcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Budcast. This week I have been very slack at getting things done, so I'm recording the intro and outro from my garden very early in the morning because it's surrounded by birds and it's just lovely. So please forgive me if I'm a bit less, if I'm a bit more echoey and there's noises in the background. But this week I'm speaking to John Walker, and John's a multi-award winning writer and his bio's really too interesting and detailed to go into here. So I urge you to look at his website, earthfriendlygardener.net, to find out more. But suffice to say, he's been my number one choice of guest to talk about peat since I began the podcast. So it's great to be able to have him on. And I started by asking John why we shouldn't be using peat.
We need to be clear about what kind of peat we're talking about for gardening, really, because we're talking mostly about sphagnum moss peat, which comes from lowland raised bogs. It's not really the peat that comes from up on mountains, the blanket bogs up on highlands. Well, not yet anyway. Hopefully it never will be. Mm-hmm. Because all peat is kind of doing the same job of sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. But the problem is when you're digging it up, that's setting all this stored carbon free, because it oxidizes when it becomes in contact with the air. And then that's obviously adding to the carbon build in the atmosphere, which has kind of led us to finally saying the words climate emergency rather than climate change or global warming. So we're talking more sensible terms now about climate emergencies. We're talking about climate breakdown, talking about global heating. So these terms are becoming much more understood, I think, and obviously got a bit more impetus to them. Mm-hmm. Because the word emergency is kind of fairly self-explanatory. But the problem with using peat in gardening and horticulture, if you're a horticulture person where you're growing plants for a living and using peat, or whether you're a gardener who's buying bags of dirt at the garden centre which has got peat in, the bottom line problem, the rock bottom problem is you're making our climate emergency worse, and every bit of peat that's been used, since whenever, has added to that, just sort of added a bit more to that sort of carbon that's floating around in the air. Mm-hmm. And then there's the sort of more physical damage that's done, because if you're buying peat-based compost, or you're buying plants that are grown in peat or peat-based compost, then you're kind of contributing to that problem. Even if you don't know you are, it's not all willful, but you're kind of wrecking nature. That's how I kind of see it now. Mm-hmm. That's it.
Yeah.
People want to kind of argue about these things and say, oh, well, use a bit of peat to grow some plants to help bees. You think, well, that's not really cutting it, So I've heard all these arguments from people, often people quite influential. They've sort of tailed off a bit recently. It's quite interesting because I think they realise these, what I would call the pro-peat pundits, they've seen that modern quality peat-free composts actually do cut it now. There are lots of growers running their businesses without any peat.
Yeah, because that used to be an excuse, didn't it, or an objection to going peat-free, was that the substitutes weren't up to scratch. But as you say, I think that's been proven wrong now, and that argument is obsolete.
So what's happened, I think what's happened is the people that would have had these kind of slightly misleading arguments, shall we say, who sort of not really told people the truth sometimes and made out things that don't stand scrutiny, they've kind of gone quiet because they know the game is kind of up for peat, although it hasn't disappeared yet. The game is up, I think, now. The beginning of the end is kind of unfolding, and no one's really got a grip on that kind of story now, because more people are finding out about this. And it has, it's a sad thing to have to have happened, but it's kind of dovetailing into for the climate predicament. And it's kind of probably making more sense to more people, because of that. Because before it kind of looks as though everybody knows about peat, the problems with peat and the advantages of peat-free. But actually, I think it's only a really small number of people that really understand it. But it looks as though everybody does. But I'm convinced that most people don't have a clue. They go to the garden centre, they buy these bags of dirt, and they're putting up some flowers or some tomatoes or something. I'm just having a bit of gardening, but they're not really thinking I'm a gardener. These are the people I call the non-gardeners, but they're the ones who are probably propping up the peat sales because they don't know. You're not doing it out of malice. They're just uninformed. They're not listening to, they're not watching Monty Don on television. They're not listening to Gardener's Question Time. They're not reading gardening magazines. They're not listening to podcasts. They're not looking at things online. They're just wanting to grow a few things, and they need some dirt to do that. And of course, it's more than dirt. But that's how I think people see these things crossing each other.
So going back to what you were saying about the carbon being released, has anybody actually measured that or estimated how much has been released since we started harvesting it for horticulture?
I mean, there are figures, but they're often sort of global totals, if you know what I mean.
Because I'm guessing this isn't just a UK problem, is it? This is a worldwide
Oh, gosh,
issue.
no. It's the sort of peat problem is called a kind of global. I mean, a lot of the sort of peat is found in the Northern Hemisphere. I've just thought of a figure. I think peatlands in total across the planet cover about 3% of the world's surface, but they hold about 30% of the carbon that's sort of stored in the soil, in the ground, in the dirt.
Right.
So they're kind of small on area, but huge on capacity.
And are we importing peat or are we exporting it? How does that work?
For gardening, horticulture in the UK, some is still mined in this country, mostly in Scotland, as far as I can tell. Some comes from Ireland, the sort of mid parts of Ireland. There are huge sort of peat mining operations there. And we get some from places like Estonia. Those European countries, they have big reserves of sphagnum peat. Yeah. So it does come from different places. And there was talk at one time, I haven't heard this recently, that the attitude is, of course, if we need something, we get it. So there was some talk of, if we can't do this, get it from here and there. People were saying, we'll just get it from Canada, which has got huge peat reserves, sphagnum peat, which is mined for the American sort of compost industry.
Yeah, that's quite terrifying. I was just wondering, as you were talking, I was thinking, obviously, people naturally think of compost, but are there other applications in horticulture? I'm just thinking of one specifically. I mean, you can buy a bag of sphagnum moss and you can use it for floristry, for example. So is there anything else that you can think of that it's hidden in, or where you might not be aware if you're a consumer, where you might not be aware that you're purchasing it?
Mostly we're going to come across it in garden compost. That's where we're going to.
Which by its very nature kind of means the plants that you're buying as well, I guess.
So you're going to come across it in the compost you buy and many, if not most, of the plants that are on the garden centre benches, unless it says explicitly it's peat free. And ironically, a lot more plants that I see in garden centres are grown without peat, because I can tell these composts, you can see by looking at them and feeling them that they probably don't contain any peat. But in 99% of cases, there's no label saying this plant was grown peat free. So they're losing an opportunity to kind of get me to buy it, because I would probably buy it straight away if it said peat free and it was a quality plant. I'm talking about real top quality plants, not plants that you wouldn't tell the difference between what they were grown in. And of course, it would be an educational point as well that could happen at a garden centre bench. And so many opportunities for this are lost by not doing this. And I think it's because some of the retailers, they probably don't even know the plants that they've had delivered are peat free. I think gardening retailers really got to get their act together. They've got to become much more educators and enablers rather than just floggers of stuff.
Well, yeah.
we don't want all this stuff. We want some gardening, not all this stuff.
Well, as you were saying, if consumers aren't leading the charge for the demand, but from the demand side, then I guess the retailers need to step up and make sure that through their supply chains they're not endorsing the use of peat.
Yes, absolutely. But if you go to National Trust properties, you may know this. All their plants that they sell are peat free. They have a proper business arrangement where somebody is growing National Trust plants, and none of their plants are grown in peat. So, but that again, that's quite a narrow sort of band of people who kind of know about it. I mean, some of them won't be bothered. They won't know or care because they'll just see these really good plants. Because I mean, the plants grown without peat are fantastic. They are sometimes better than the ones grown in peat. So they, all these things are happening, and some of it's very successful, but it's hard to see it because it's not labelled and nobody tells you. If you're in a garden centre, lots of commercial tree growers don't use peat either. Lots of herb growers don't use peat. They're peat-free. Perennials, peat-free. Lots of gold medal winning displays at Chelsea Flowers Show are stuffed full of plants that are grown without peat. They're all peat-free. I mean, they do sort of have little notices up, but I mean, I want them to have big flags up, waving them around, because it's the only way you're going to reach the sort of non-gardening people is to wave flags around and make a bit of a fuss, so they think what's going on over there, because otherwise they're just doing their bits of growing and not really connecting with the importance of, you go into a garden centre and the difference between buying bag A and bag B is absolutely fundamental. One bag is actually wrecking nature. The other one comes with some costs. Everything comes with a cost, but it's nothing like digging up, peat bogs and liberating stored, which is carbon, which is effectively a fossil fuel, which is what peat is, and sending that up into the air. Because this sort of strange thing I saw a few years ago, somebody was saying, it's all right to use a bit of peat-based compost because you can grow flowers that benefit bees. What they forgot, or perhaps they knew but forgot to mention, of course, was that you can, once you're digging the peat up, the effects of the carbon are not being confined. This isn't confined to our garden boundary. It's not confined to our country. This is adding to a global problem. This sort of climate emergency, which affects all species, ourselves included. So they're doing not worrying about it because it helps a few bees. I just think, well, what about the bees